The millionaire is surprised by a street child's request. A simple plea for help can change everything. The story of Lucas will move you and show that even in the toughest moments, a dream can become reality. No one believed what happened on that street. The sun beat down fiercely, and the shadows of the city's large trees seemed to offer no relief whatsoever. The sound of horns, the roar of cars, and the frantic movement of people on the sidewalks gave the impression that the world was spinning too fast. But amid all that chaos, something extraordinary took place. A child, seemingly invisible to everyone's eyes, approached a man in an impeccable suit, the kind of man considered a symbol of success. He stepped out of a luxury car, and the world around him seemed to fade away as Lucas, with his eyes fixed on the ground, drew closer to him. Welcome. I am Marcos Paulo, the storyteller. Leave a comment below and tell us where you're watching from. Enjoy the story. Lucas was an 8-year-old boy, but he already carried the hardness of a life without love or opportunities. His clothes were torn, his hair was dirty, and his bare feet touched the hot concrete of the sidewalk. Life on the streets was not easy, but in his chest a spark of hope still burned. He knew that somehow he needed to do something different to change his reality. So he lifted his head, looked at the man, and without hesitation made a request that no one could have anticipated. He didn't ask for food. He didn't ask for shelter. He asked for something far more valuable, a chance. The child looked directly at Marcos Oliveira, the billionaire owner of several companies, and made a request as simple as it was bold. Sir, I just need a chance to study. I want to learn. I want to change. Marcos's reaction was instant. He looked at Lucas for a moment, as if the boy were invisible, as if he weren't there, as if that plea were just another echo lost in the city's chaos. But something in Lucas's eyes made Marcos stop. It was as if, suddenly, the world around him vanished, and he was gazing at something much greater than he could have imagined. The question everyone asked afterward was, why did this humble request from a simple child touch Marcos in a way that nothing else ever had? After all, he was a man accustomed to dealing with numbers, profits, and successful businesses. What made him pause to listen to Lucas, a dirty street child, in the midst of such a hectic day? No one knew the answer with certainty, but what happened after that brief exchange of words would completely change the destiny of both. And who would have thought that such a small gesture could have such an immense impact? At that moment, Lucas's eyes shone with an intensity Marcos had never seen before. It was the look of someone who, despite everything he had faced, still believed he could be more, that he could do more. It was a plea from a human being wanting to be treated as such, wanting to be heard amid a world that neglected him. Until that point, Marcos had never known how to react to something like this. He was used to requests for help, but nothing had touched him as deeply as Lucas's simple plea. But the truth is, for Marcos, the initial reaction was one of indifference. He didn't know what to do with that unexpected request. He knew that helping Lucas could change everything in his life, but he was so immersed in his own problems and routines that he didn't know where to begin. After all, what could a rich man like him do for a street child? He had resources in abundance, but at the same time, the social indifference that had protected him for years prevented him from acting. Yet, in that instant, something inside him began to shift. Lucas's steady gaze remained fixed, awaiting a response. The child didn't realize it, but he was planting the seed of a revolution in Marcos's heart. The real question wasn't the request itself, but what it represented. The breaking of an invisible barrier between the world of the rich and the world of the poor. Unbeknownst to him, Marcos was facing a reflection of himself, someone who, despite having everything, was still lost in an endless pursuit of more power and money. And in that moment, when their eyes met, he was confronted with something he lacked, the true need for change, for humanity. He knew that moment would alter the course of his life, though he didn't yet know how. What would he do next? What would come after this simple yet transformative request? And most importantly, was Marcos ready to change? The answer to those questions would only come in the following minutes, but one thing was certain: Lucas's request would not be ignored. Something within Marcos, even against his will, had awakened. And instead of simply walking away, he stayed there, standing still, looking at Lucas with a strange sensation in his chest. The change had begun, and for both, the future would never be the same. Lucas was a child marked by the streets, a reflection of a system that ignored him. From a very young age, he learned that the world had no place for people like him. Without a true family, he grew up on the streets, surviving on alms and small odd jobs. His clothes were always dirty, his feet calloused from the hot city concrete, and his thin body bore the visible scars of chronic neglect. There were no warm homes, no comforting hugs, only the brutality of a city that never saw him as someone worthy of attention. For him, dreams seemed as distant as the stars in the night sky. But there was something no one saw: the resilience he carried in his young heart. Despite the circumstances, Lucas had not lost his essential humanity. He never stopped dreaming, and his greatest hope was simple yet powerful: to study, to learn to read and write, so that one day he could change his life. Every night, before sleeping in some improvised corner, he looked at the stars and dreamed of a better future, a place where he could live with dignity. He wanted more than the street could offer, more than the other children his age could envision. He dreamed of helping other kids like him, giving them the chance he never had. But to achieve that, he needed something the street couldn't provide: an opportunity. But Lucas's desire was not something he could conquer alone. He knew he lacked the power to change his reality. The street had taught him to survive day by day, but not to thrive or dream big. He had no one to guide him, no one to show him the way to a different future. No matter how hard he tried, he always felt invisible, ignored by the city's powerful who passed him by without a glance. The system pushed him into dark corners, where children like him were forgotten. No matter how much he dreamed of a different future, Lucas knew his fate seemed sealed. He was no more than an anonymous face in the crowd, a lost child in the urban shadows. Yet Lucas had a trait that set him apart: he never gave up. He faced each day with courage, even when his strength seemed to falter. He knew the world treated him with contempt, but that didn't mean he would accept that reality as his own. Deep down, Lucas believed he had something valuable to offer. He didn't want to be just another lost child. He wanted to be someone important, someone who could make a difference. But for that, he needed a chance he knew was unlikely to come from others. His greatest struggle, however, was not against the street or the indifference of those around him. It was against the constant doubt that crept into his mind. Would he ever succeed? Would someone see in him what he saw in himself? He knew his humble origins didn't help, that the scars of his life were deep, but he also knew that education was the key to unlocking a future he had never had. Education meant freedom to him. It meant a chance to change the world, not just for himself, but for all the other boys and girls who, like him, had been forgotten by society. Though he had the burning desire to change, Lucas found himself trapped in a situation where he had no control. He lacked the means to seek the help he desperately needed. He knew deep down that power was in the hands of a few. And as the world spun around him, he felt that his place was not in any of the spaces he saw every day: schools, universities, the offices of big businessmen. For him, those worlds were closed off, unreachable, like castles guarded by high, impenetrable walls. The door seemed always locked, and he, with his rusty key, didn't know how to open it. But something inside Lucas prevented him from giving up completely. Perhaps it was the memory of the children he had met on the streets, with the same eyes full of hope and despair. Perhaps it was the desire not to be like all the others who had been lost in the shadows. He knew that to change his destiny, he would have to be more than the world expected of him. He would have to be someone different, someone who wouldn't bend to circumstances. And though the path seemed nearly impossible, he wouldn't stop trying. Because in the end, Lucas believed that the only thing he truly possessed was the ability to dream, and he clung to that with all his youthful strength. And in that moment, as he looked at the billionaire passing before his eyes, Lucas didn't know that the chance he so desperately wanted was closer than he had ever imagined. Fate, as unpredictable as it was, had something reserved for him. What he didn't know was that this encounter with Marcos Oliveira could be the first step to changing the course of his life, the first step to stop being an invisible child on the streets and become someone capable of realizing his greatest dreams. What Lucas didn't know was that that day would change his life in a way he never imagined. After making his request to Marcos, the billionaire didn't give him an immediate response. Instead, he simply ignored him and got into his luxury car, driving away without looking back. Lucas felt the weight of rejection pressing on his small chest. He knew the world wouldn't hand him easy opportunities. He was used to being ignored, but the pain of Marcos's indifference hit harder than anything he had felt before in his short life. As Marcos drove away in his gleaming vehicle, Lucas stood there feeling empty, as if everything he believed he had gained had been cruelly snatched from his hands. The worst part was knowing he might never get another chance to try again. Rich and powerful people like Marcos were untouchable, living in a separate world. They didn't see the misery, the pain, or the dreams of children like Lucas. To them, he was just another dirty face in the crowd, someone no one cared about. Rage built up inside him, and sadness made his small body feel even heavier. But as he prepared to return to the street, a strange sensation kept him rooted to the spot. What happened next was an unexpected and disturbing blow. A man emerged from the crowd, a rough-looking figure who approached Lucas with a cold, threatening smile. He introduced himself as an investor interested in helping the boy. But Lucas, with his street-sharpened instincts, sensed immediately that something was wrong. The man seemed to want something more from Lucas, something he wasn't willing to give. When the man suggested Lucas join a dirty scheme of smuggling illegal goods, the boy instantly recognized the danger. The offer seemed tempting in his desperation, but he knew that path would destroy him even more than the street already had. Lucas refused firmly, and the man's reaction was immediate and aggressive. He threatened the boy, saying that if he didn't get involved, he'd see what happened to kids like him on the streets. Threats of violence began to surface, and Lucas felt his stomach churn with terror. He knew the world he lived in wasn't kind, but he had never imagined it could be so cruel. Fear began to take hold of him, and for a moment he considered giving in, accepting the offer to ensure his survival. But as he looked at the man's hard face, he realized he couldn't let his life be defined by threats and empty promises. He refused once more, his voice trembling but resolute. The man's words were etched into Lucas's mind like a scar. You have no choice. The world won't give you anything for free. Either you adapt or you're devoured by the street. What hurt Lucas the most was that those words sounded like an inescapable truth, but he refused to believe them fully. He didn't want to be just another cog in a dirty system. He wanted to be different, to find a clean path where he could be proud of his choices. But in his vulnerable situation, options were few, and the challenges seemed insurmountable. He felt cornered against the wall with no visible escape, but at that critical moment something happened. As the man advanced threateningly, a group of passers-by began to notice the scene. Some, without hesitation, started filming with their phones, while others intervened bravely to prevent the situation from escalating further. The man, realizing things were spiraling out of his control, retreated quickly into the crowd, promising in a low voice that Lucas would regret rejecting him. As he disappeared, Lucas felt a mix of relief and burning anger. He knew that in that instant, his life had taken an unexpected turn, but the fight was far from over. The feeling of helplessness didn't leave him, and he was aware that at some point he would have to face even greater threats. Fear, however, didn't paralyze him completely. What motivated him was the look in the eyes of the people who helped him, The way those ordinary souls, perhaps also ignored by the system, stood up to protect him. It was there, in that moment of unexpected solidarity, that Lucas began to understand the power of unity, the power of people who, even with nothing, could make a difference. He didn't know what the future held, but one thing was clear: he wouldn't be alone anymore. The battle was just beginning. The weight of the man's words still echoed in Lucas's mind as he walked through the city's relentless streets. The feeling of humiliation he had experienced in that encounter was something he never imagined he would feel so intensely. He had always known that the street wasn't kind, that rich and powerful people lived in a separate world, but he never thought a simple plea for help could be met with such cruel disdain. But as always, the doors remained closed. Lucas wasn't heard. He was ignored and threatened once again. The rejection, which he had known for a long time, now felt more bitter and merciless than ever. He had been treated like a mere piece of trash, something disposable. That sense of helplessness ate away at him from within. He knew that, as a street child, he rarely had a fair chance to change his life. The system condemned him to live without prospects or opportunities, as if his existence were irrelevant to society. Marcos Oliveira, the billionaire he had approached with hope, hadn't given the slightest importance to his sincere request. Even with the opportunity to help a child in desperate need, he simply ignored him, as if he weren't worth his time. This made Lucas feel an even greater rage inside. It wasn't just Marcos's cold indifference that bothered him, but the reality that this man, with all his power and wealth, felt no empathy for him. To Marcos, Lucas was nothing more than a number, a statistic among the many forgotten children of the elite. The boy couldn't understand how life could be so unjust. Children like him, those born on the streets, were treated as invisible. No matter how hard he tried, he couldn't find an explanation for so much systematic abandonment. He knew poverty wasn't his fault, but it seemed society went out of its way to blame him. People passed by without even glancing at him, as if he were a ghost, someone who had no right to occupy the same space. The humiliation of being treated this way hurt more than any physical blow he had endured. He felt small, worthless, a completely disposable human being. Despite all this, something inside Lucas refused to be extinguished. As he walked the streets aimlessly, he realized the only thing he still possessed was his inner dignity. Though humiliated and rejected, he refused to succumb to the system that wanted him submissive. There was something within him that cried out for more, something that wouldn't let him be shaped by his circumstances. He knew the only way to survive in that cruel world was to become strong enough to challenge the rules imposed by the powerful. As the sun set on the horizon, Lucas sat on a park bench, watching the people around him. He noticed that even in his pain and solitude, he still had something others didn't see: hope. He didn't know where that hope came from, but it was still there, like a fragile yet persistent flame. The humiliation he felt at that moment could have been the end of his struggle, but he wouldn't allow it. Something inside him told him he couldn't give up, that this couldn't be the end of his story. The rage and pain he felt at that moment began to transform into a renewed strength. Marcos's rejection, the cruel words of the street man, all of it became fuel for his unyielding determination. He wouldn't be an invisible child anymore. He would fight for what he wanted, for what he felt he deserved. Though the path was arduous, he knew there was no turning back. The time of submitting to indifference was over. He would start changing his story, one step at a time, until no one could ignore him ever again. And so, Lucas began to realize that though the world treated him with contempt, true strength lay within him. He had the power to turn his pain into something much greater. He just needed to find a way to do it. In that moment, he decided he wouldn't be humiliated anymore. He would take the reins of his own life, and nothing and no one would stop him. He knew the battle would be tough, but he was ready to face it. Lucas walked the streets with a new purpose. The pain of rejection still burned in his chest, but he now used it as fuel. He didn't know how he would do it, but the idea of changing his life became the only thing that mattered at that moment. Each step brought him closer to a new opportunity, a chance he was determined to create for himself. The humiliation of being ignored by those who should have helped him had awakened him to something greater, the need to fight for his own transformation. He couldn't wait for someone else to change his life. He would have to be the change he so desired. He knew the first step would be to learn to read and write. But how would he do it? Schools were far beyond his immediate reach. He had no money to buy books or materials. Yet the street, which had long imposed limitations on him, now also seemed to offer a possibility. In a forgotten corner of the city, he found a humble public library, a simple place that shone in his mind like a unique opportunity. It was there that he could begin his journey, the first cornerstone of his personal construction. With the little money he had scraped together from alms, he bought an old, worn notebook and began dedicating himself to what he most longed for: learning. At first, the words were confusing and the texts incomprehensible, like a strange code he couldn't crack. But Lucas didn't give up. Each word, each sentence he managed to understand was a small step toward his dream. He spent hours in that dusty library, reading under the dim light of a flickering lamp, writing with a worn-out pencil. Sometimes his hand ached from the effort, and his mind grew tired from trying to grasp what seemed so distant from his reality. But he persisted with fierce determination. Even when the difficulties seemed insurmountable, he forced himself to continue. He knew he couldn't go back. This path was the only one that would lead him to something greater. During the first months, Lucas felt completely lost in his new world of letters. The other street children saw him as an oddity, someone wasting time on something that wouldn't bring him anything useful in their daily struggle. They mocked him, saying he should focus on surviving rather than learning something so useless for their harsh reality. But he ignored the taunts with courage. He knew the path would be lonely, that few would understand his choices. But in his heart, he felt that this was more than a personal quest. It was a mission. If he could learn to read, he could teach other kids like him. He could give them a chance he never had. It was on one of those solitary afternoons, while studying under the weak light of a flickering lamp, that he met Doña Ana, a retired teacher who lived in the building next to the library. She had been watching him from afar, intrigued by the effort of this boy who spent hours there, even with so few resources. Doña Ana approached him kindly and offered her selfless help. She explained that learning didn't depend on how much money you had, but on determination and the will to move forward. She became the first person to believe in Lucas's hidden potential. That help was like a seed planted in fertile soil. He knew that, with her by his side, education would cease to be just a distant dream. Over time, Lucas began to master words and phrases. Each page turned, each text understood, was a personal victory that filled him with pride. He no longer needed others to tell him he was capable. He knew it himself. His confidence grew with each small achievement. The sleepless nights, the moments of doubt, and the difficulties faded into the background like vanishing shadows. He had begun a journey that went beyond academics. It was a journey of self-overcoming, one he knew would change his life and the lives of many others. But, like every new beginning, it wasn't easy. The fear of failing was still there, always present, trying to undermine his newfound confidence. But Lucas learned to deal with that fear like an old friend. He understood that fear wasn't a sign to give up, but a warning that he was about to take an important step. He learned to embrace fear as part of the process, to use insecurity as a force that would propel him even further. Doubt was gradually replaced by unwavering determination. Lucas no longer saw himself as a lost child on the streets. He saw himself as someone with a purpose. At the end of a few months, Lucas began to be recognized for his relentless dedication. He was no longer the invisible boy of the street. He had become a symbol of hope for others, a living example that change is possible, even when the world seems against you. He realized that by believing in himself, he was building a support network around him. The change wouldn't be easy, but he knew he was now on the right path. He had a mission, and he would fulfill it with all his youthful strength. With Doña Ana's constant support, Lucas dedicated himself even more fervently to his studies. She helped him understand not just the words, but also the concepts he had never had the chance to explore. Each lesson with Doña Ana was a new discovery. With each passing day, he felt more capable, more prepared to face the difficulties still ahead. The small library, which once seemed just a temporary refuge, now became his true battlefield. He knew that there, among books and notebooks, he was forging his own future with his own hands. As he progressed in his learning journey, Lucas also began to become a beacon for others. He started teaching the basics of reading and writing to other street children, even with limited resources and harsh conditions. His street peers, who once mocked him, now saw him as an informal leader, someone who had achieved something they all thought was unattainable. By doing so, Lucas wasn't just teaching, he was also learning more about himself and his ability to influence others. However, the threat of being ignored and marginalized by the world never fully disappeared. Prejudice and discrimination lurked at every corner, in every distrustful glance from passers-by. Rich and powerful people like Marcos Oliveira still seemed to see him as an invisible child, someone never worthy of a real opportunity. But Lucas, now with more knowledge and determination, refused to be shaken by this. He understood that prejudice couldn't define his reality, and that his trajectory was being built through his actions, not by how others perceived him. It was during one of his visits to the library that Lucas found something that changed his perspective entirely. A talk on social entrepreneurship. He had never considered that he could create something beyond his own survival. But that talk opened his eyes to a new, exciting possibility. Perhaps, instead of just trying to change his own life, he could build a platform to help other children in similar situations. The idea of creating an educational center where kids could learn and have the opportunity for a better future began to take shape in his mind with renewed strength. He knew he couldn't do it alone. To put his plans into action, he would need resources, support, and perhaps even the help of someone like Marcos Oliveira. But unlike before, Lucas no longer feared being ignored or rejected. He knew the future was within his reach, and the only thing stopping him from seizing it was the lack of courage to take the next step. He wasn't waiting for a chance anymore. He was creating his own opportunity. The decision to start his entrepreneurial journey was difficult, yet at the same time exhilarating. He knew that creating something big, something that truly made a difference, wouldn't be easy. But what he didn't know was that the first major obstacle was about to arise, and he would need all his inner strength to avoid giving up. For weeks, Lucas and his street companions began working on the project of a community educational center. But soon, the first signs emerged that not everyone was willing to support such a bold and revolutionary cause. The biggest challenge was the chronic lack of resources. Lucas tried to raise funds to rent a suitable space, buy basic materials, and provide at least a minimum of comfort for the children he wanted to help with all his heart. He sought support from local schools, churches, and even organizations claiming to be committed to social causes. However, many showed indifference or skepticism. Some called his project unrealistic, others simply ignored him. That rejection was a hard blow to Lucas, who once again felt like an invisible child, someone trying to cry out for help without being heard. With the failure to secure funds, Lucas found himself out of options. He and the other children who accompanied him began to wonder if all this was truly possible. They had all been so excited at the start, but now doubt spread like a dark cloud. They had the dream and the will to change, but nothing else tangible. The streets seemed to have won again. And worse still, Lucas began to question his own ability. Was he dreaming too big? Was he deceiving himself with an unattainable illusion? It was at that moment of despair that Lucas received a proposal that nearly made him abandon everything. An investor, who had observed his effort and progress from a distance, approached him and offered significant funding for the project, but with a strict condition. He wanted Lucas to step away from his original mission of helping street children and start a training center for promising kids, those with clear potential to succeed in society. He didn't want an educational center for all, but only for a select group of privileged individuals. Lucas found himself facing a heart-wrenching moral dilemma. Accepting the money and support would mean sacrificing his pure vision and selling his deepest principles. The investor's proposal hammered in Lucas's mind like a relentless drum. He was so desperate for resources and so close to seeing his dream come true that, for a moment, he considered giving in. Maybe, if he accepted, he could achieve something concrete. But as he looked at the other children who had always believed in him, he realized that taking that offer would mean betraying his sacred mission. He had started this journey to change the lives of those who needed it most, not to benefit a select group of privileged individuals. He felt that accepting would be a betrayal of the values that had brought him this far. That night, Lucas couldn't sleep a wink. He tossed and turned in his small space, his mind filled with doubts and overwhelming anguish. He knew the offer was tempting and almost irresistible, but he also knew that wasn't why he had begun. He couldn't live with the guilt of betraying everything he believed in. At dawn, Lucas made a firm decision. He rejected the investor's offer despite all the risks involved. He knew the path would be much harder, but he was willing to face every obstacle if it meant not compromising his purpose. He believed that somehow the universe would help him find a better way. In the days that followed, the difficulties intensified like an unrelenting storm. The lack of resources and absence of external support made everything seem even more challenging and bleak. But Lucas, once again, found strength in the people around him. Doña Ana, who had always believed in him, and the children who followed him with devotion continued to fight by his side. They were willing to keep going, even without knowing what the uncertain future held. The streets remained merciless, but Lucas's determination was beginning to spread like a slow fire among his companions. Though the almost fatal obstacle had nearly broken his fragile spirit, Lucas now knew that his journey had reached a turning point. He couldn't afford the luxury of waiting for others to save him. He would have to be the change he so desired to see. The next step would be the hardest, but Lucas was already prepared to face it with courage. He had learned that the greatest enemy he needed to overcome wasn't in the streets or the people who scorned him, but within himself. Doubt and fear would be his biggest challenges, but he was determined to confront them head-on with everything he had. Lucas was on the verge of giving up. The pressure of continuing his project, the scarcity of resources, and the lack of support were pushing him to his limit. He spent sleepless nights trying to find a solution, but the answer always seemed out of reach. Frustration was taking over, and he began to doubt his own ability to change things. It was then that something unexpected happened. During a visit to an old community center, where he sought ideas for his own project, he encountered an unknown man who seemed to know exactly who Lucas was and what he was trying to achieve. This man, with a simple appearance but a deep, wise gaze, approached Lucas with a phrase that caught the boy off guard. "I know what you're trying to do with all your heart." Lucas, wary from his street experience, looked at him with caution, unsure how to react. How could this man know about his project? How did he know of his struggles? The stranger revealed that he had been observing Lucas for some time, impressed by his determination and courage. He introduced himself as Felipe Martins, a businessman who had grown up on the streets like Lucas and now used his wealth to support social projects that truly made a difference. Felipe explained that, unlike the investor Lucas had rejected, he believed that true education should be accessible to all, not just to those who fit a specific success profile. He told Lucas that, though the journey would be tough, He was willing to help with resources and experience. "I went through everything you're going through now," Felipe said with empathy, "and it was education, real education, that gave me the chance to change my life. It wasn't wealth or luck. It was the determination to never give up, even when the whole world seemed against me." Lucas, still skeptical due to his natural distrust, didn't know what to think of this offer. He had always believed that rich and powerful people were above others, that they only cared about their own interests. But Felipe was different. He didn't seem interested in profiting or using Lucas for his own gain. He seemed genuinely committed to helping. With Felipe's proposal, Lucas felt something he hadn't felt in a long time: hope. Felipe offered him initial funding to start the educational center, but with the condition that Lucas remained true to his original mission: to educate and support the children who needed it most, without discrimination. In the days that followed, Lucas deeply reflected on what Felipe had said with such sincerity. He knew the proposal represented a significant risk, but he also recognized that Felipe's help could be the boost he needed to turn his dream into a tangible reality. Felipe wasn't just offering money, he was providing an ally, someone who had faced the same hardships and knew exactly how to fight against adversity. And most importantly, he was offering Lucas something he had never imagined: the possibility of creating a lasting legacy, of leaving a mark on the world, not just with his personal story, but with the lives he could change. Lucas accepted Felipe's proposal, but with a clear condition. He wanted Felipe to be his mentor along the way, guiding him and teaching him everything he needed to know to lead such an ambitious and transformative project. Felipe agreed with joy and enthusiasm, and together they began planning the implementation of the educational center with a community focus. For Lucas, this was the opportunity he had been waiting for. He knew the road ahead would be difficult, but now he had the guidance of someone who had faced the same challenges, and most importantly, he was no longer alone. But at the same time, a new threat began to emerge. As Lucas and Felipe worked tirelessly to structure the center, a powerful philanthropic organization which had dominated the city's social assistance landscape for decades, viewed the project's growth with suspicion and distrust. They feared that the success of Lucas and Felipe's educational center would divert attention and financial resources from their own initiatives, which often focused more on maintaining their prestige than on creating real change. What Lucas didn't know was that this organization was willing to do anything, even use underhanded tactics, to ensure the center didn't succeed. The key leader of this organization was Fernanda Almeida, a powerful and charismatic woman who had built her philanthropic empire by exploiting programs that, on the surface, seemed designed for the well-being of street children, but in practice offered little more than empty promises. Fernanda had a very clear and rigid vision of how things should be done: total control over education and the lives of vulnerable children. When she learned of Lucas and Felipe's educational center, she acted immediately, using her influence to undermine everything they were building with such effort. To her, the project was a direct threat to her position, her status, and her hidden source of power. But Lucas was no longer willing to be intimidated. With each challenge he faced, he felt stronger and more prepared. He knew he was fighting for the right cause, giving a voice to those who had always been silenced. Felipe, by his side, constantly reinforced the importance of staying focused on the mission. "The real fight isn't against her, Lucas," Felipe said wisely. "It's against the system she represents: indifference, inequality, the lack of opportunities." Felipe's words echoed in Lucas's mind as he prepared the speech he would give at the major meeting with investors and allies. The tension in the conference room was almost palpable, like a thick cloud enveloping everyone present. Lucas and Felipe sat at the table, facing Fernanda and her allies, who maintained an arrogant and self-assured posture. Fernanda, with her cold smile and calculating gaze, launched the first verbal strike with the intent to destabilize them. She began attacking the idea of the educational center, claiming it was unrealistic and that Lucas lacked the experience and resources to manage something so large and complex. She used her vast experience and influence to discredit everything Lucas and Felipe were trying to build with sweat and heart. But Lucas, for the first time in his life, didn't let those sharp words overwhelm or intimidate him. With firmness and confidence, he stood up from his chair and looked directly into Fernanda's eyes. "You're right, Fernanda," Lucas began with a clear and resolute voice. "I don't have the experience you've accumulated, but what I do have is the determination to change the lives of thousands of children who, like me, have been left behind by this system. What we have isn't an empire of lies, but a real chance for transformation. And that, none of your words can take away from us." Lucas's words had a profound and resonant impact on the room, like an echo that couldn't be ignored. Fernanda, accustomed to manipulating situations to her advantage with her charisma, didn't expect such a brave and direct response. The silence that followed was heavy and pregnant with meaning. She tried to counter with elaborate arguments, but realized her speech no longer carried the same intimidating weight. Lucas was determined, and his sincerity and passion shone through every word. He wasn't there to beg for approval. He was there to demand respect and concrete action on behalf of the marginalized. The turning point came when Lucas, with a surprising calmness that contrasted with the tension, responded to Fernanda's accusation. "You say it's impossible, but I was a child like so many others you ignore every day," he said, looking straight at her. "You talk about big corporations and success models, but I am the result of what happens when society decides people like me don't deserve a chance. I don't have a corporation behind me. I have a dream, a purpose, and a group of children who believe in that dream with me." The room fell into a stunned silence. The power of those words was so great that Fernanda couldn't respond immediately. She tried to disguise it, but her posture began to waver visibly. The confrontation reached its peak when Lucas concluded his speech with a phrase that etched itself into everyone's memory. "I didn't come here to ask for your help. I came to show that what's happening in the streets, in the schools, in our cities, is no longer something we can ignore. I'm creating a better future for all of us. And if you don't want to help, then at least don't get in the way." That statement was a watershed moment. The audience, previously divided between Fernanda's supporters and Lucas's, now saw the reality clearly. Lucas was no longer a child begging for a favor. He was a leader, and his project had become a legitimate movement. In the end, Lucas's victory wasn't just about gaining approval for the educational center, but about the respect he earned from everyone in that room. Fernanda, publicly defeated, though still holding some power, tried to hide her discomfort, but she knew that in this direct confrontation, the power had shifted hands. Lucas had finally won the battle, not only against the authority figures who had ignored him, but also against the system that had marginalized him. He was ready to move forward, stronger than ever, with his mission clearer than ever. The future was now his to shape. The impact of Lucas's speech was immediate and overwhelming. When he finished speaking, the room fell into absolute silence, as if time had paused for a moment. No one dared to break that pause laden with emotion. His words, filled with passion and courage, had touched the hearts of everyone, even those who had been skeptical before. Fernanda, usually so confident, was visibly shaken, and her arrogant smile had completely vanished. Lucas knew there was no turning back. He had achieved something far greater than the approval of investors or sponsors. He had won the respect and trust of an entire city. However, what seemed like a resounding victory for Lucas also brought new, unforeseen difficulties. After the meeting, news of his defiant stance spread like wildfire throughout the city. The system he was challenging wouldn't allow his mission to proceed without fierce resistance. Pressures began to emerge from all sides. Some of Fernanda's allies, with significant power and influence, started making subtle threats to undermine Lucas's educational center. Promised donations were abruptly withdrawn, and some strategic partnerships began to dissolve under external pressure. The city, which initially seemed to support the project with enthusiasm, was now filled with uncertainty and hesitation. But Lucas was no longer alone. The support from the children and other community members was stronger than ever. They organized with admirable determination, coming together to raise funds on their own, promote community events, and ensure the project moved forward despite the threats. Their unity was more powerful than any external obstacle. Lucas, with his heart full of gratitude and resolve, watched his friends and supporters and knew that this was what truly mattered. They weren't there just for him, they were there for the cause. And that was all he needed to keep going. Felipe, who had always been a calm and balanced mentor, also felt more motivated than ever by Lucas's bravery. He knew the resistance they faced wasn't just a matter of resources, but of deeply rooted ideology. He had warned him that fighting the system would be tough, but seeing Lucas's strength, he felt renewed in his commitment. Felipe took the lead and began working behind the scenes to secure the project's financial future. He contacted new ethical investors and formed alliances with other social groups that, like Lucas, wanted a more just world for everyone. Meanwhile, Lucas, still processing the positive response he had received from so many people, took a moment to reflect on the magnitude of what he was beginning to build. He knew the path wouldn't be easy or free of setbacks, but the consequences of his victory were profound and lasting. He hadn't just faced the system, he had shaken it to its core. People were starting to realize that what he was doing couldn't be ignored any longer. He had finally become the voice for those who couldn't speak for themselves. He knew that, for the street children, the educational center was much more than a school. It was their only chance to escape the same reality he had endured. The feeling of victory also brought with it a heavy emotional burden. Lucas, now more mature, began to understand the immense responsibility that came with his mission. He wasn't just creating something for himself anymore, but something that would have a lasting impact on the lives of so many others. He often thought of the children still on the streets, unaware that they could have a better future. How could he ensure his mission didn't become another empty promise that faded with time? He knew the fight was far from over. The real work was just beginning, and he was ready to give it his all. But amid the difficulties and pressures, something extraordinary happened. Fernanda, publicly defeated, but still with enough power to try to sabotage the project, did something no one expected. She sought out Lucas in a private meeting. She approached him with caution, and unlike her previous arrogant attitude, she was willing to listen. In a rare moment of genuine vulnerability, she admitted, "I've always seen things from a selfish perspective. I never realized the impact a project like yours could have. Maybe I've lost my way along the path." The silence between them was significant. Lucas, surprised but with an open heart, listened attentively. He knew Fernanda wasn't offering help out of pure altruism, but that simple admission of being wrong was a clear sign that his mission was gaining strength. It wasn't just the community that was changing. Even those who had once seen the world differently were being touched by the transformative power of his vision. That conversation marked a turning point not only for Lucas, but for everyone around him who supported his cause. He knew he would still have to fight tooth and nail, but now he understood that even those who seemed like enemies could be influenced by the force of his ideal. As he left the meeting with Fernanda, Lucas felt a wave of positive energy surge through his body. He knew he was on the right path, more certain than ever. The resistance wasn't just an obstacle to overcome, it was a reflection of the great transformation happening around him. He was more prepared than ever to face the consequences ahead, with the certainty that his mission transcended any obstacle. Change was in motion, and he wouldn't stop until his goal was fully achieved. As the educational center flourished and his vision took tangible shape, an unexpected reunion took place. Lucas was at a community event, promoting the project and thanking new supporters, when, glancing at the crowd, he saw a familiar figure that made him pause for a moment. In the distance stood his mother, a woman he hadn't seen since he was very young. She was there, standing still, watching him with eyes full of regret and deep pain. The shock was immediate. His mother, who had abandoned him in childhood, had returned. Lucas felt a whirlwind of emotions: anger, pain, confusion, and surprisingly, a touch of compassion he didn't expect. He didn't know what to think or what to do. She approached cautiously and, with tears streaming down her weathered face, said, "Lucas, I know you can't forgive me now, but I've been watching you. I've seen what you've done, what you've become, and I'm so sorry." The silence between them was long and heavy with unspoken history. Lucas looked at her, and for a moment, memories of his childhood flooded back. The lonely nights, his mother's absence, the pain of being left behind. She began to explain what had driven her away, the hard life she had led, the mistakes she made in her desperation, and how she never knew how to care for him as a mother should. But over the years, she had followed his struggle from afar, and seeing what he was achieving, she realized how much he had grown into someone capable of changing the world around him. Now, with the life she led, she understood the immense value of education and the importance of a second chance. "I failed you, my son, but please, let me do something right in this life. Let me help." Lucas felt a storm of conflicting emotions. The wounds of the past were very deep and still fresh in his memory, but he knew he couldn't change what had happened. The anger he felt for being abandoned was still there, pulsing in his chest, but he also knew that the life he had now was the result of the choices he had made on his own, choices that didn't depend on anyone, not even his mother. He looked at her, not with resentment, but with a silent sadness. He knew forgiveness wouldn't be easy or immediate, but something inside him told him it was the only way to move forward, so that the pain of the past wouldn't anchor him to suffering forever. He took a deep breath and with a firm yet emotional voice said, "I don't know if I can forgive you right now, but what I can offer you is something I learned on this journey, the chance to do the right thing. You can't erase what happened, but you can start changing now. And I'll help you if you truly want to change." She stood there, silent, her eyes glistening with emotion and gratitude. He didn't know if this meant complete forgiveness or immediate reconciliation, but in that moment, he knew they were at least taking the first step toward possible healing. In the days that followed, Lucas and his mother spent more time together, building bridges. He invited her to visit the educational center and see firsthand the impact his work was having on the community. They talked about the past, about the hardships they had both faced separately, but also about the possibilities now opening up before them as a family. For the first time, his mother offered to help with the project, contributing her time and experience in support activities for the children, showing a genuine desire to redeem herself. She knew that, though her past was a burden she couldn't change, she could at least try to make a difference in the present. Lucas didn't know what the future held for him and his mother, but in that moment, he felt something rare and precious: peace. It wasn't the peace of a complete resolution, but the peace of having taken a step toward forgiveness. He knew the road would be long and that the wounds might never fully heal, but what mattered most was that he was willing to try. He didn't want resentment to stop him from being who he had become: a leader, a mentor, someone capable of transforming the world. The reunion with his mother was a milestone in Lucas's journey. He realized that true overcoming wasn't just about external victories, but about the ability to face the past and not let it define his future. He now understood that forgiveness didn't mean forgetting the pain, but giving himself the freedom to move forward. And as he and his mother grew closer, he felt that finally he was achieving something he never thought possible: the freedom to leave the past behind and embrace a hopeful future. Over time, Lucas's educational center grew exponentially and astonishingly. What began as a humble, modest project in a borrowed space had now become a true symbol of transformation for the city. The impact of Lucas's work, of the children who now had access to quality education, began to spread rapidly. He hadn't just fulfilled his promise to change his own life. He was now transforming the lives of hundreds of other boys and girls, giving them an opportunity the world had never offered them. Recognition began to come from various fronts. The local community applauded him with enthusiasm, charity organizations started supporting him with resources, and even prominent public figures began to praise Lucas's transformative work. But the greatest recognition came from something he never would have imagined. Marcos Oliveira, the billionaire who had ignored his plea for help months ago, now approached Lucas, offering a genuine partnership. Marcos, after observing the impact the educational center was having on society, decided to invest in Lucas's project. Not for profit, but because he finally recognized the true need for the action Lucas was leading with heart. Marcos, who had always been a man of numbers, decided it was time to change his perspective. He didn't want to be remembered as a man who ignored a child in need, but as someone who helped build a more just future for all. He approached Lucas and with palpable sincerity apologized for his past indifference. "I was blinded by my own world," Marcos admitted. "But what you're doing, Lucas, is something that will leave a legacy far greater than any company I've founded." Lucas, with the maturity he had gained through his struggle, accepted Marcos's help, but made it clear that his mission would never be corrupted by money or power. "The only thing I ask," Lucas said firmly, "is that the support be genuine and come from the heart, with no expectations of control. We're here to change lives, not to enrich ourselves with it." This moment was a turning point for Lucas. He realized he no longer needed to prove anything to anyone. He had earned the respect of people who once seemed untouchable. He was no longer the invisible child of the streets. He had become a leader, someone who had faced indifference and rejection, and who was now in a position to make a real difference. He knew his fight hadn't been in vain. The recognition didn't come with money or fame. It came through the change he had brought to the lives of those he most wanted to help, and that was more valuable than any material reward could ever be. However, Lucas knew the true reward wasn't public recognition or applause. It lay in the transformation he was creating around him. Each child he helped, each family he saw change their lives through education, was what truly mattered. He was watching the future he had dreamed of become reality before his eyes, and that motivated him to keep going, to give even more of himself. He wasn't just shaping the future of those children. He was shaping his own future by ensuring the cycle of poverty and exclusion was broken. And as the educational center thrived, Lucas also began to see his personal life blossom unexpectedly. He reconnected with his mother, with whom he now shared a new understanding of forgiveness and second chances. She was by his side, helping at the center and showing him that, despite past mistakes, there was still room for love and rebuilding. That renewed bond, that forgiveness which wasn't easy but was sincere, was perhaps the greatest reward Lucas could have received. He knew that regardless of the challenges ahead, he had found the inner peace he had long sought. But Lucas's journey was far from over. He knew that, though he had achieved great victories, there was still much to be done. The success of the educational center wasn't the end, but only the beginning. The impact he had made in the city now needed to expand to other communities. He wanted to leave a legacy that wasn't just a building with walls and books, but a real transformation in how society viewed street children. He wanted future generations to grow up believing that anyone, no matter where they came from, had the right to learn and prosper. It was during a visit to a new space he was helping to open that Lucas encountered some of the first boys and girls he had helped on the street. now students and aspiring leaders in their own communities. The cycle was completing beautifully. He wasn't just helping the children learn anymore. He was seeing them grow and begin to transform the lives of others in turn. That was the impact he had dreamed of. The reward wasn't just in the project's success, but in the living legacy he was creating, a legacy of hope, learning, and above all, dignity. With the educational center now well established and fully operational, Lucas found himself facing a new cycle of opportunities and challenges. The project was no longer an idea born from the chaos of the street, but a solid reality that was transforming lives in a tangible and lasting way. The children who once lived without hope were now students with dreams of a better future. Lucas had become not just a leader, but an example that change is possible, even in the most unlikely places. The educational center began to expand, reaching other areas of the city and, over time, other regions that, like the streets where Lucas came from, lacked access to quality education. The demand for more centers and more resources grew exponentially, and Lucas found himself once again facing a significant decision. He now needed more help, more committed allies, and above all, more resources to ensure the project continued to thrive. But unlike before, he was no longer alone. He had built a robust support network, including businessmen, educators, and community members who shared the same vision, a more just world where all children had equal opportunities to shine. With each new educational center opened, Lucas felt he was fulfilling his sacred mission step by step. But he also knew that to continue this transformative work, he needed to expand beyond the limits of his hometown. He wanted to take his revolutionary idea to other parts of the country, and who knows, perhaps even the world. He knew his journey had no defined end, and that obstacles would be constant and varied. But what motivated him now was something much greater, the certainty that his mission was a flame that couldn't be extinguished by anyone or anything. He was no longer fighting for recognition or approval. He was fighting for a future where no child would be left behind in the dark. Amid this ambitious expansion, Lucas also found time to reflect on the person he had become. He looked back and saw himself as that invisible child on the streets, wondering how he had come so far. He knew the answer lay in education, in the opportunity he was given, and in the willpower he had to never give up. He understood that often the greatest challenges aren't external, but internal. Doubt, fear, lack of confidence, all of that could have paralyzed him, but he chose to move forward one step at a time. He also began investing in programs to train other local leaders, ensuring his mission wouldn't depend solely on him. He wanted others, with the same vision and passion, to have the tools to create change in their own communities. The future of Lucas's educational center was being solidified, but he knew this would only happen with a collective effort. He wasn't creating something for his own glory. He was building something for everyone. He wanted the project to be replicated, to spread like a support network where children would no longer be treated as invisible, but as the leaders of tomorrow. The city, which once looked at him with distrust, now saw him as a hero. But Lucas didn't see himself that way. He knew his work wasn't about being admired, but about ensuring the next generations had a better path. He was creating a culture of change, where people understood that to transform society, they first had to transform themselves from within. He believed education was the key to that transformation, and he was determined to open that door for as many children as possible, regardless of their origins. Lucas also noticed that his mission was beginning to influence not just the children, but the adults around him. Many of the teachers working with him, once skeptical about the real impact of his work, now saw the transformation happening before their eyes. They watched children leave the streets, go to school, and become leaders in their communities. And that was just the beginning. They were starting to grasp the transformative power of education and how much it could change not just a child's life, but the future of an entire generation. He found time to reflect on his own personal growth. Looking back, he saw himself as that invisible child on the streets, wondering how he had come so far. He knew the answer lay in education, in the opportunity he was given, and in the willpower he had to never give up. He had understood that often the greatest challenges aren't external, but internal. Doubt, fear, lack of confidence, all of that could have stopped him, but he chose to keep going, one step at a time. Lucas rose from his chair and looked out the window of his humble yet welcoming office. He knew the world, though full of constant challenges, was also brimming with infinite possibilities. He no longer looked to the future with fear, but with the certainty that he had the power to shape it with his own hands. He had found his true mission in life, and by doing so, he had created something that could never be erased or forgotten. The impact of his work would continue to grow, and as he gazed at the horizon, Lucas knew there was still much to be done. But now he had the confidence that nothing was impossible, and that he could conquer everything his vision reached. With a calm, serene smile, he murmured to himself, "I was never invisible. I always knew I could be more. Now, I know everyone can be more. The future belongs to all of us." That reflection marked the close of his personal journey, but also the beginning of a collective movement that would transcend generations. I am Marcos Paulo, and this has been the story of Lucas. Leave a like, share with those who need to hear this, and never forget, a small act of kindness can change the world. Subscribe for more inspiring stories. The screen faded to black, but the echo of his words lingered, inviting every viewer to reflect and act with their hearts.